From the St. Francis Yacht Club in San Francisco, this is the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon, hosted by Ron Young.
Welcome to the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon, live from the virtual grill room of the St. Francis Yacht Club. We hope that you and your family are sheltering in place in a comfortable environment, and we look forward to greeting you back in our yacht club just as soon as conditions permit. Our speaker today has a fascinating life story, and he tells a fascinating story in his new book, The Great Depression: An Intimate View. The parallels with today are ominous. During 1919 through 1929, an international pandemic killed nearly 500,000 Americans. A long bull market became volatile with wild gyrations. Political turmoil enveloped America, an all too familiar scenario during this current pandemic. Ed Linz traveled the United States in the late 1990s, interviewed Americans who survived the Great Depression, like my parents and his parents. His resulting book, They Never Threw Anything Away, captures a broad spectrum of those timely memories and provides a blueprint for our current generation to survive our own uncertain economic, cultural, and social challenges. Linz will recount the turmoil of the 1920s, leading to the difficult years of the 1930s, while profiling 22 of the 50 amazing Americans whom he interviewed. Ed Linz, welcome to the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon.
Hey, thank you so much, Ron. Happy to join you. Brings back memories of my times as a junior officer on a submarine in Vallejo. I actually lived up in Napa, and then I was on the other side of the Bay Area. I got married down in Palo Alto, so real familiar with San Francisco.
So where were you born, and what year were you born, Ed?
I was born in Kentucky. I lived on a farm on the Ohio River. I was born in 1943.
Yeah, that was a pretty good year, 1943.
Let me guess why.
So you're at the beginning of the baby boom, I happen to know. You're like at what we call the baby boom scout. Right after you, there was this huge population bubble as guys came back, as Americans came back from World War II and started families. The Eisenhower administration, the Roosevelt, and then the Roosevelt and Truman administrations put in place economic tools and policies that helped create a image of America that was renowned around the world. People everywhere wanted to have two cars in their garage because they could see the same thing on I Love Lucy. And as television spread our culture around the world, the GI Bill and the boom in education that came after World War II became a symbol of American success and actually helped sell American goods for generations thereafter. So when you were a little kid, when was the first time on that river that you got on a boat of any kind?
Well, my dad had only gone to the third grade, and he worked in a foundry before we moved out to the farm. And he always wanted a boat, so he bought a 12-foot aluminum boat, put a very small motor on the back. We went out in the Ohio River with it. I wasn't sure we'd be able to go against the current to get back to where we put in. I somehow got my left foot underneath the keel, and I still have the scar from that.
So the hook of nautical life was set early in your case.
I never saw a sailboat until I went to the Naval Academy in 1961.
So what were you like in high school? Give me the picture of Ed Linz high school.
I was in a Catholic schools. Neither of my parents were Catholic, but they put me in Catholic schools thinking they're better. We had a situation in Kentucky, believe it or not, where they had a high school where the boys could skip the 7th and 8th grade. And so I finished high school at age 15, had a scholarship to a local Catholic college called Villa Madonna, which has since changed its name and moved like a bad debtor. But through some very long story, I ended up at the Naval Academy in 1961. I had really never seen a ship except on TV.
How did this poor kid from Kentucky get to the Naval Academy?
Very long story. Basically, my mother was a nurse, and we went to visit one of her friends, and they had some 8mm movies. Her son was at the Naval Academy, and I saw an 8mm video of that. And I said to myself, that's a ticket out of Kentucky. So I applied to my congressman. The story was that there was a football player there who had a lock on the nomination, but I ended up getting it. Later on, my mom told me the real story 20 years later, that when she was working as a nurse, the executive assistant to the congressman was one of her patients. And I don't know if she pulled the plug on him and said, how much do you want to live? But apparently that's how I got the nomination.
Well, we've all fallen in love with nurses before, so she must have had really her wily charms worked out in your case. That's great.
One of the stories in my book, the final story in the book, is called The Girls, and it's about 4 of the ladies who went through nursing training with my mother during the 30s at a hospital is where they did nursing. They didn't call it nursing school, they called it training.
So give me your education. You later on become a teacher. You think that?
Well, I majored in mathematics at the Naval Academy, got a BS. Later on, I went to Oxford, Christ Church College. I have a master's from Oxford in economics. I also have a master's from George Mason University in secondary education. And I wanted to work with children when I got out of the Navy, and that's why I went into teaching.
When you're a high school kid, what sports did you do?
We didn't recognize football as a sport. There was, our high school we had baseball and basketball, and that's what I played. In Kentucky at that time, everyone played basketball.
What position?
I was a guard. I was short. I can't say that my crossover dribble was great, but I could shoot free throws. So I tried to draw fouls.
Okay, so you get to the Naval Academy. There you are from Kentucky. Give us a story from the beginning of the Naval Academy life.
Well, it was, for me, it was a shock. As I said, I had never seen a ship. Many of my classmates had experiences due to their own parents. Others were just like me, had come from Wyoming and places such as this, never seen ships. I loved it because of the food. My mom was a lousy cook, and I thought I didn't know there was such a thing as medium rare beef. I did well academically because I had already had 2 years of college, and I ended up getting on the debate team and actually competed very successfully on the debate team in my junior year. We finished 4th in the country at the NCAAs.
Great. Who beat you?
Boston University, 2 really fast talking dudes.
Okay, so after the academy, then what?
Well, I went into submarines. I spent the next 20 years in submarines. As I said, my first submarine was the Gurnard in new construction at Mare Island. Went out there and very busy, but enjoyed the Bay Area quite a bit. As I said, I lived up in Napa. I was sort of a free spirit. I had a motorcycle and rode all around up there in the Valley of the Moon, and was down in San Francisco as much as I could be. Down there during the Janis Joplin era there in San Francisco, and went to football games with the 49ers at Kezar Stadium, where you could carry caseloads of beer on your shoulders to come in to watch the games. And there was generally always a stripper that would do an impromptu strip at halftime in the stands.
I was there.
I remember watching Gail Sayers run 2 kickoffs back in the mud in Kezar for touchdowns, and no 49er came within 5 yards of him either time.
Yeah, our team was, I'm sorry to say, pitiful as a 49er fan back in those days.
Yeah.
I earned money in high school selling Cokes in that Kezar Stadium.
Oh, yeah.
And it was a interesting thing. The first time I got paid, the guy asked me, where's your social security card? And I thought, my social security card. I knew I'd had one, but I hadn't seen it since wherever. So I just rattled off a number. I gave him a number. and later on, when I went home, I searched around, and sometime later I found it. and it was the right number. but I'd never held a card since. I haven't seen it since, but it is the right number.
After that tour, that ship ended up in San Diego. Went to the East Coast. I was navigator on a ballistic missile sub, the Nathaniel Greene. Then I went to Oxford, came back and was executive officer of an attack submarine, the Tenosa, which operated in the Mediterranean, and then took command of Kamehameha, which had the 16 ballistic missiles on it. I had basically 160 nuclear hydrogen bombs aboard my ship. So it was a lot of responsibility. Enjoyed it. To me, the Navy, being on submarines was the ultimate boys' night out.
So how long was the sub?
In feet?
Yes.
You mean?
How long
it was around
overall length overall?
Roughly 400 feet, roughly.
Uh-huh.
And had a draft of about 35 feet.
Uh-huh.
So you couldn't just pull into any port with it, obviously. And there were security implications also with a reactor and that many weapons.
When I used to ask buddies this next question back in the day, they would never answer the question, but it's been 50 years. So how fast was the sub going? How fast
it obviously it depends whether you're on the surface or submerged.
Right.
On the surface, those ships don't go very fast, maybe 12 to 15 knots on the surface. Submerged, you could go on a ballistic missile sub, you could go maybe 20 knots. And if you're on a fast attack submarine, they could get up around 28 or so, something like that. The Russian subs were faster, but our advantage was we were quieter. And that's how you could trail them. You could hear them, they couldn't hear you.
What was the scariest part of being in that service?
The scariest part? Having a collision underwater with a Russian submarine. Also, a long story I don't want to get into now, but we did hit bottom one time doing 11 knots on the Grenard, that fast attack sub, the first one off of San Diego. It was a charted seamount. It's a long story for why we hit it, but the terrain off of San Diego underwater is just like the terrain inland. It's a bunch of mountains.
And so this was uncharted. They were wrong.
No, it was charted. It was charted. The captain got relieved. I happened to have the con right before we hit. I got off on the third day of testimony or in the inquiry because my lawyer correctly argued that I did not technically have the con because the captain gave a direct order to the con saying left full rudder. And about a minute later is when we hit.
Wow. Holy cow. So did you hit, was it soft? What kind of,
it was a glancing blow off. It was gray sand, 43 fathoms of gray sand on the chart, right on the chart. But the long story, at that time, there was no satellite navigation. And I don't want to go into all the details, but put it this way, it was an avoidable collision.
So underwater, what visibility and how do you see what's what? Can you see through the periscope or you sonar? How do you know where you're going? How do you know what's in front of you?
You can't see anything in front of you. You can't see anything. The periscope is used when you come up to periscope depth and you look around up there. But underwater, you're going totally blind. That's why you need to make sure you got charts, but you can also hear things. You can hear whales, you can hear marine life, and you can hear other ships. And you learn their sonar signatures from, but it's all passive. You only know the bearing to that object. You don't know the distance.
So when you get out of the Navy, tell me the next part of your
I started teaching high school math and physics, and then I started coaching. I got sick in '91.
Where was this? Where were you teaching?
In Northern Virginia, public high schools in Northern Virginia. Got sick, I got diagnosed with this very rare disease called cardiac sarcoidosis. The doctor said, we don't know what causes it. There's no known cure. And he gave me 2 years to live. And I was essentially asymptomatic. Long story, it's all covered in my book, Life Row, when I talked about this. Anyway, I got progressively sicker. I couldn't walk from here to my mailbox without gasping for breath. Went into the hospital, assumed I was going to die. They said, we might be able to get you a heart. At that time, my problem, this disease causes electrical problems in the heart. the signal from the top of the heart to the bottom of the heart. And so it was being blocked. Anyway, by 94, I assumed I was going to die, but I waited in the hospital for over 3 months, IVs in both arms, keeping me alive. And then on the 9th of September of 94, the nurse rushed in and said, "Mr. Linz, we have a heart for you." And so I was very blessed. Almost died following the transplant because my lungs and kidneys crashed. My heart was good, but I was in a coma for 3 weeks. My wife, who was a nurse, they wouldn't even let her in the room. Miraculously recovered, went out to the Grand Canyon the following May, hiked to the bottom, hiked back out of that sucker just to prove I was back. And everything's been positive since then. 2 years ago, I went to Tanzania and tried to climb Kilimanjaro, made it up to 15,000 feet, ran into a problem up there. But anyway, I did make it to 15,000 feet on Kilimanjaro.
Good for you. Good for you. So now you've written 4 books.
Right.
What caused you to write the first, second, third, and fourth book?
Well, the first book was about my transplant. It was called A Case Study on How a Family Can Survive a Medical Crisis. I didn't want to just be, he got sick, he got a new heart, he lived happily ever after. I wanted to be able to provide information of families where they have faced with some very difficult diagnosis, what they can do to get through it. The second book was a textbook called Team Teaching Science, how you teach science to a class that has both special needs students in it and regular students in it. Third book was a novel I wrote in 2015. I had always wanted to write a novel. It's a road trip story, but it's almost all the characters are women. I have a female heart inside of me, and maybe I drew upon that. It's very, very racy book. It's also on Amazon called Hurtling to the Edge. And then I did all these interviews, Ron, back in the 90s, where I went around the country and interviewed people who had lived during the Depression. I did that on a tape recorder and took notes. And I saved all those in a big plastic tub until the summer of 2020. Quite frankly, I was waiting for the people to die because I had not gotten releases to use their stories. So once they're all dead, I put this story together, and of all these people I interviewed, I took the 22 best stories, and that resulted in this book, They Never Throw Anything Away. It has a very interesting cover on it, and which I got from Walker Evans, a very famous photographer during the 30s. He was working for the government, went to Hill County, Alabama. This family right here on the cover it's a very famous photo.
So my folks and yours came from that era, the Depression era, lived through it. And my Uncle Bob, my Dutch Uncle Bob, wasn't really a relative, but after my father died, he became the friend of my mom. They never became married. They just were genuinely really good friends. Anyway, Uncle Bob never threw anything away. As a survivor of that thing, and I would go to his garage in Bernal Heights in San Francisco, around the corner from where my mom and stepmom lived. And he had, 6 screwdrivers, flathead, different ones, different sizes. He'd have, 7 or 8 Phillips heads. Some of them were kind of broken, but it didn't matter. And they were all in the Phillips head section of the garage, tool bin. And he would have, when I would ask for something, he helped me build my home office, from which I'm talking to you in Mill Valley. Anyway, he helped me do all these things. And whenever I would go to buy something at the hardware store, I'd say, wait. And he would come back 2 days later and he'd give me what he had was the closest to that. You know what I mean? I needed a piece of plywood. Instead of buying a piece of 4x8 plywood, no, wait. And he would come back 2 days later and he'd give me a 3 foot by 2.5 foot piece of plywood, which worked fine, fit what I needed. And that would be the plywood. And when I would go to his garage, in San Francisco, he had the plywood over here and he had the chipboard over here and he had the solid wood over here. And it was kind of all organized. And the garage was completely full. He kept his garage full. There was no room for cars in this garage. It was really his parts warehouse.
Well, I got the title from the book when my mom passed away in 91. My son and I went to Kentucky to clean out her house. And we found, among many other things, a cardboard box in the basement, totally filled with pressed, used tin foil. They didn't call it aluminum foil. And that's where I got the title, They Never Threw Anything Away.
Perfect. Let's look at the book. So how long was it in the writing? How long did it take to write this?
It took me the summer of 2020 to write it. I had several people fact checking it for me. I'm very proud. I have not been able to find one typo in the book, as opposed to some of my others. but I put it together the summer of 2020, and it got published last year on Amazon.
When you went to, did you have an editor?
No, I should say yes. I had like 4 editors, all friends who went through it tooth and comb. I've written so much over the years. I'm a good writer, and people rarely change anything that I write in terms of, I've had some suggestions saying maybe you could say this a little bit better and that. But basically, I have one guy that's a conceptual editor who basically says, I think you need to focus on such and such. The others are all grammar. I had a lady that I called the comma queen. She used to teach English and was anal about commas. So
on the Oxford comma issue, where do you come down?
Well, I use commas wherever I want to, and I don't get, for example, I don't worry about a sentence ending in a preposition and things like that. In high school, I went to, the English book we used was composition and rhetoric. So I know pretty much how to spell, etc. It's just, I mean, I got a lot of things I'm not good at, but writing is something I feel comfortable doing. Mm-hmm. You will see in the book that when the people talk, I have that in one font, and then I explain what they're talking about often in a different font. For example, one of the people talked about having a Hupmobile, and most people now have never heard of a Hupmobile. So I go through where Hupmobiles came from and when they ended, that sort of thing. This one aviator had a Curtiss Wright pusher, an aircraft. There's a picture of that in the book, and I had to explain the background for that. One of the people was talking about that they always, whenever they were sick, their mother would give them an enema. Well, a lot of people don't know what an enema is now. I mean, that sort of thing. So a lot of explanations about what's going on, including what the CCC was, the WPA, all of these programs during the 30s, which people, it was part of their lives. Anyway, basically what I want to talk about briefly is that people often think the Depression began just in 1929. What I found out was that there had been a very severe depression in the early 20s when all the soldiers came back and they didn't have work. And there was considerable unrest during those 2 years. Harding was elected in a landslide. One of the people that I'm talking about, actually, her father helped Harding get elected. He was just sort of a country bumpkin from there in Ohio. He was very popular but he died in San Francisco, as a matter of fact. I don't know if you know that, due to a heart attack. His reputation that was ruined afterwards because of the Teapot Dome scandal. He was succeeded by Coolidge, old Silent Cow. Interesting, he had over 700 press conferences, although they called him Silent Cow. Hoover came along. He was an orphan. He had very much San Francisco ties. He went to Stanford. Interestingly, he failed all the exams to get into Stanford except one, but he literally had the rich uncle who he was staying with because he was an orphan. He was up in Oregon. Ultimately became very wealthy as a mining engineer and as a consultant. He had been in Australia where he first started. He was in China during the Boxer Rebellion and ended up being a pretty much of a philanthropist, ended up in politics. He actually worked for Wilson at the Democrat. Then he became in the 20s, for Harding and Coolidge, he served in their administrations, was the most powerful cabinet member. Ron, a lot of people don't realize it, but during the 20s, it wasn't just a roaring 20s. There were 600 banks a year that failed. The farmers had all these terrible problems with weather, and they really were having a lot of issues out there at the time. The stock market began going up, pretty much like it has in our recent past. It actually hit its peak on September of 29. Then the very famous Black Days of October occurred, with Black Thursday on the 24th, 28th, and 29th. Just for those of you that hold stocks right now, a little bit of beware. Once it reached that low on November 23rd of 1929, it took 25 years for the market to recover. Also, during the Depression, it was not all, hey, Roosevelt came in, everything got wonderful. Things did get better for a few years, but then in 37 and 38, everything started going south again, and very hard times. And what bailed the country out was the war in Europe was ginning up. And so all of our industrial might started to crank up, providing jobs. And that's what really was sort of the end of the Depression.
What happened leading up to World War II economically that you think caused the beginnings of the end of the Great Depression? Wasn't it government?
A couple of things. One, the government started spending money to gear up building ships and things like this.
Right.
One of the fellows I interviewed worked in Southern California in the aircraft manufacturing business down in Los Angeles during 38 through 39, and things were booming there in terms of jobs available in the aircraft industry.
Right.
Obviously, that was a lot of government spending that was taking place on that. In terms of how much private enterprise cranked up to meet these needs, I'm not sure. But certainly, the fact that the war in Europe was on the horizon caused the government to say we need to build up our armaments.
Didn't Henry Kaiser go to Roosevelt and say, there's going to be a war and you don't have any ships? And Roosevelt asked Kaiser, have you ever built a ship? And he said, no, but I've built factories. I'll build shipyards. Once we have shipyards, we can have ships.
That's true. I've heard that story before. And also, many of those ships were built in the Bay Area.
Yes.
Oakland and places like that, further to the
Richmond.
inland. Yep, Richmond. All of these, you can still go out there and see where all the ships are stored today out there, the old ones, but those were huge shipyards cranking out incredible numbers of ships. This all provided jobs, and obviously it filtered through the rest of the economy, not just on the two coasts where the ships were being built and the aircrafts being built, but I know in Cincinnati, the area that I grew up near, the General Electric had huge plants building engines for all these. So it went throughout the whole economy. When FDR came in, you can see from this slide, he put in these programs, the CCC, that was just for young men. And these were jobs building state parks. When I was coaching out in West Virginia, I took my kids out there to train in West Virginia at Capon State Park, totally built by the CCC. Beautiful wooden buildings, wonderful trails. It's still there today. People don't understand that they were paid $30 a month, but $25 went directly to their parents. They never saw it. They got $5 a month. The FHA, the Housing Administration, you can see that slide. The TVA is still there, still providing power to the middle of our country.
Talk about the TVA. People don't realize the Tennessee Valley Authority electrified a big part of the country and set a model for the value of electrification. Talk about that a little bit.
Absolutely. When it was started, many of the farms, particularly, or many of the people living in the South and the Midwest, did not have electricity. This was a huge factor in the electrification of the country, and it still exists now. The father of the nuclear submarines, Admiral Rickover, went down there, another long story, when he was trying to figure out how to build nuclear submarines. The WPA, I want to talk about that because so many of the people that I interviewed actually had jobs in the WPA. It was different than the CCC because these were not only road building jobs, but the artists, people that were putting on plays, writers,
Photographers.
Yes, exactly. And as a matter of fact, the photographer Walker Evans, he was sent down to Hale County, Alabama to interview sharecroppers. And it covered all different disciplines, and it involved women. Women could get these jobs. Several of the people that I talked to had good things to say about the WPA. Other people, interestingly, did not like the WPA because they said all those guys are doing out there leaning on their shovels all day. So I found mixed reactions to it, but mostly positive reactions. And I don't need to tell you about Social Security. I'm drawing some right now, as a matter of fact, and hopefully it'll continue for a while longer.
The WPA buildings in San Francisco include the Maritime Museum. I'm on the board of the Maritime Museum.
Really?
And it's got beautiful museums in it. There's all kinds of big WPA projects in the whole Bay Area. And back on the shipbuilding, actually San Francisco Bay Area, including Marin City, Mare Island, Vallejo, Alameda, Richmond, and Hunters Point became the actually largest shipbuilding area in the world, literally bigger than Norfolk, Virginia, which was the single biggest shipyard at the time. But the whole Bay Area became this amazing shipbuilding essentially center, especially Liberty ships. And Kaiser was sort of the lead architect of that process. Roosevelt went to a business guy, but then used government spending to stimulate the economy and basically bootstrap us out of the recession or the depression with these big government projects.
I might add also, Ron, that those shipyards brought in literally tens of thousands of people as workers from all over the country. This was a magnet. These were jobs. Right. And people just left wherever they were and fled to or were drawn to the Bay Area. And it was a huge factor in terms of not only our success at winning the war, but in terms of building up San Francisco as one of the important parts of the country.
My mother and grandmother left their farm in Pitcher, Oklahoma, Cherokee country, and left the land and came to San Francisco as part of fleeing the Dust Bowl. The Dust Bowl was behind them, as my grandmother said. She just kept going because the dust kept chasing them.
I had several stories like that I encountered. I just want to mention here that you can see that Evans was working for the Farm Security Administration and was on assignment down there with James Agee in Hale County, Alabama. And this picture, I was drawn by the little girl's eyes, the girl that's standing. It looks like she's peering directly into your soul. Also, look at their legs. Their legs were all beat up. The grandmother has on clodhoppers. But I just thought it was a striking photo of how desperate things were in some families there. What I found, though, I interviewed people, as you'll see in a few minutes, but I interviewed people from all over the country in all different socioeconomic groups. This first lady here, Vorta May Honold, who is from Wood River, Nebraska. I met her at the George Washington University Hospital Women's Club. I was invited to speak about organ and tissue donation. They liked me so much that they invited me to become the first and only male member of the club. And the reason was because of my heart transplant, I had a woman's heart. So to this day, I'm the only male member of the club. I was sitting next to Vorta May, and she said, honey, I need to talk to you. So she actually was living in the Watergate, the famous apartment building there on the Potomac. And you can see the China book in the background because later in her life, she actually ended up working for the CIA, actually the OSS, the predecessor to the CIA in China. And she was there during the revolution. And she had a real dislike for Chiang Kai-shek. And because she said he was far more brutal to the Chinese people than the communists were.
Okay.
And very interesting. Her father, basically, her mother had postpartum depression right after she was born and was put in an institution. And her father, who was a postman and a farmer, raised her. But he had a job, which I found out to be very important, Ron. If you had a job, you were okay during the Depression. If you had a farm that wasn't taken over by the banks, you could make it okay. But everyone else had problems. So her father was a postman. Vorta May was very straightforward with me and winked a lot and told me a lot of intimate things about growing up. And I said, Vorta May, can I put that in the book? And she says, honey, I'm old. You can put anything you want in there. Her father, because she didn't have a mother, her father, excuse me, I didn't mean to change that, raised, go back. Her father had her raised by sleep-in nurses. That's the phrase she used. And she said, the nurses took care of me during the day and they took care of my father during the night. So she had a lot of really interesting racy stories about that. But she did say that there was no rain that she could remember during 1931. And it really became a dust bowl. So her father did have that job. And so he bought a lot of things from other people to give them money. And he had this tremendous collection of antique guns all the way back to the Revolutionary War. And so those are still in a museum, I think, in Hastings, Nebraska. She was a very interesting person that you can see from the China book behind her. Her grandfather went to VMI, Virginia Military Institute, and served as a Union officer in the Civil War and became a very wealthy rancher in Wyoming. She ended up getting a job in DC in the late 30s via one of her uncles, who was a politician. And she started out as a GS1 and worked her way up. She was working with $1-a-year men. Do you know what a $1-a-year man is, Ron?
No, I don't.
Those are rich individuals that worked for the US government at the time, during, just prior to and during the war. They could not volunteer. You're not allowed to work for the government as a volunteer. So they took $1 a day, $1 a year, and they became $1-a-year men. And Vorta worked with a lot of these rich guys and ended up having her getting into the OSS. And that's how she ended up in China.
Wait, what did they do when they had these positions? The $1 a min, I do sort of remember about this. The $1-a-year men then kind of pushed government policy to support issues that they were supporting, or what did they do?
Yeah, I mean, they would work in government, like a guy like Mellon, one of the really rich guys, would come in and be an economic advisor. They worked for, they weren't actual cabinet members, but they were very influential and powerful individuals in government at the time. A whole lot of these people, if you Google it, you can find out a lot about them, because $1-a-year man. This fella I interviewed is a son of some Polish immigrants. His real name was Twarzanski. They came through Ellis Island, like a lot of people, ended up on a farm in Long Island that was given to them called a free farm, where guys own land out there, and they didn't want to work it, so they'd let other people work it and share the proceeds with them. He worked on an estate as a youth, as a caddy and taking care of the golf course for one of the most rich men in the country named Otto Kahn, very famous financier. He was actually then, as a teenager, he would run documents down on Wall Street, but he got laid off and he came back and his brother, who was on his right, started this big band. They started a band that played all the speakeasies all over Long Island. They actually, as teenagers in their young 20s, they hired all of these musicians. He would interview the singers like this young woman here. They even had a vaudeville comedian. This was all done by his brother, Tony, who was younger than he was. And I thought it was interesting that when the prohibition ended in December 5th, 33, they were playing in a club and everyone got incredibly drunk. And he said, we just kept playing louder and louder and louder as the fights broke out. But very interesting guy. He ended up when the band, they all had to go in the army, so the band broke up and he ended up working for the VA. Next person I talked to was Diana Pippenhaus. She was also an immigrant family, Greeks. That's her father, the rather stern looking guy there on the right. Diana is the girl with her hand on her chin at 12. At 9, she was diagnosed. They moved to LA. And his dad, of course, started a Greek restaurant. What else did Greeks do? And she got tuberculosis when she was 9 years old and put into a Catholic sanitarium, which was run by Mother Cabrini. Several of the people watching may have heard of the Cabrini orphanages, hospitals, and things that she started all over the country. She said the nuns were very mean to her. They had one in particular that would scream at them, at these little girls, don't touch me, I'm holy. So she had a lot of great stories, but she was cured and came out, married a guy that she met walking her dog that flew an airplane and landed in a field next to her. And that didn't work out. She ended up getting divorced from him and married another Greek guy. Actually, this was a true Greek, she said. And they started a whole series of restaurants in LA. She was at the Olympics in 32 and met all the, like Clark Gable, Harlow, all of the famous Lombard, all of the famous actresses she actually met and later knew because they would come to her husband's speakeasies there in LA. She ended up in San Diego owning the Grotto restaurant in San Diego. Real interesting person. She told me about the Long Beach earthquake. This is one of the photos that she actually gave me of Long Beach. Very interesting. When that earthquake occurred, you can see 70 schools were destroyed. Almost all the schools were brick and they all collapsed. The only reason there were not thousands and thousands of casualties, including a lot of children, Ron, was that the earthquake occurred around 5 in the afternoon after everyone had gone home.
Yeah, see the brick facade just fell off that house up there. Yeah.
Yeah.
That apartment, whatever it is. Yeah.
I'm trying to go to the next slide. Oops, missed it. Okay, the next one I want to talk about is a guy I met in the post office line in Key West, Florida. I was standing behind a one-legged black guy, this guy, J.C. Evans, and said, "Excuse me, sir, how old are you?" And he said, turns around, looks me up and down with disgust and says, "What the hell is it to you?" And I said, "Well, I'm doing a book about the Great Depression. You look like you were alive then." And he said, "Damn straight I was." Meanwhile, everyone is looking at us. By the time he said, "And it was the best time of my life," I said, "I need to talk to you, sir." And he invited me over. Time we got up to the clerk, we're best friends. And he invited me over to his home, just a block off of Duval Street, the main drag in Key West with all the bars. And he was living with a black woman that I'd estimate somewhere between 25 and 65 years old. Anyway, my brother-in-law took her out in town, bought her drinks, and I interviewed JC. He was very interesting, Ron, because he worked in the turpentine forest in southern Georgia, near where he was born there in Sylvester. Never went a day to school in his life, not one day. Said at age 17, his words, "I went into the woods." That means the turpentine woods. He had like 7,300 trees that he was in charge of. I learned far more about turpentine than I ever wanted to know but basically I can show you how this is how you get turpentine out. I thought it came from the sap. That's wrong. They score the trees, and if you can see right here, there is a bucket that a tin bucket underneath that collects this resin that oozes out. He would then come along when the bucket would get filled and dump it into a bigger bucket, and another fellow would come by. These are all black gentlemen that worked in the forest, and take that away to the distilling plant there on the farm. There it was distilled. The turpentine boils off first, but one of the byproducts is resin, which is found on every pitcher's mound. It's called rosin. The white powder rosin comes from this extraction of turpentine. He said they never cheated us. They paid us. We stayed in the turpentine dorm with other guys. And every 2 years, I would get myself another car. He said I was the most popular black guy in town. But wonderful interview, had a lot of other stories in the book about him. The next lady I talked to was Mary Janette Roberts. She is the lady on the right here.
The teacher?
You notice to see her left arm. She never would allow anyone to see her right arm because she was at age 4, was wearing this dress made out of this fabric called organdy that you may or may not have heard of. So a very flammable material. A coal at a picnic landed on it, caught it on fire. She started running, which made the fire worse. Her mother grabbed her, rolled her on the ground, but her arm was burnt, severely burned. She's one of the true heroes of this era, these country school teachers. She rode 6 miles on a horse in the morning to this school, had to start the potbelly fire in the middle of the school, teach grades 1 through 8, and then ride back home in the evening during wearing leggings. You had to wear a dress while you were teaching. Also, interesting fact, none of these ladies were allowed to get married. If you got married or if you got pregnant, you got fired immediately. Immediately. This situation, Ron, existed up until the middle of the war, that's when states started changing the rules, allowing these ladies to get married, only because the male teachers were called into service and they desperately needed these ladies. But she had an interesting story. In one of the schools she taught at, there were 3 Hispanic children, a 1st grader, a 6th grader, and an 8th grader. The 1st grader was a boy that was throwing spitballs at the blackboard while she was teaching. So at recess, she said, "You're going to have to stay and make 1,000 spitballs." Her 6-year-old brother, the 6th grade older brother, said, "My brother ain't staying, Miss Roberts," and came over and grabbed her from behind and put a knife at her neck. The only reason she said I'm alive is because his older sister in the 8th grade screamed at him and told him to put the knife down. And she said, but they just, the boy obviously got into a lot of trouble, but they allowed him to stay in school. She had a lot of interesting stories about this, about how much they were paid. It was like $70 a month. Once again, she began this when she was 19 years old. You did not go to college. You just finished high school and became a country school teacher and would teach the other kids. Very, very interesting. Real heroes in my mind of the US. Very wealthy lady. Her grandfather's pictured there, John Stevens. He was a railroad engineer that had the reputation of being able to build railroads in the Northwest where no one else could. When the canal got into trouble, Teddy Roosevelt called him to Washington and said, "I desperately need your help. I need to send you to Panama to make that canal." He went down there, changed the entire plans for how the canal was going to be built, and basically built the canal. In 1930, took his granddaughter, Virginia, down to Panama on a steamship, and they were celebrities before they were celebrities. She told me with a wink again, she said, "Honey, I could have had a date for breakfast, lunch, and dinner." And then she laughed and said, "And you know what? I did." When she came back, she had met the son, one of the officers down there, a young officer that she dated, was the heir to the Campbell soup fortune. And she also was a close friend of the singer and dancer Ginger Rogers. And Rogers actually loaned her her limo one time in New York City to go shopping. Virginia ran in different circles, but in the book, I wanted to present a picture of the US. It wasn't all dust bowls and doom and gloom. There were some people that were doing pretty well during the Depression.
Where did you take this photo of her? Where was she?
I was actually in her home in Goshen, Indiana.
Wow.
That's her. That was her when she was sitting there. Very, as you can see, a very elegant woman. Very elegant.
So she's at this point, this is the 1990s, so she's 80 something at the time you take the picture?
Right. Yes.
Okay.
I
Great.
did this. This interview was probably in about 97. So she would have been 87 years old.
Thank you. It's great.
My cousin who lived out in Elkhart County, Indiana, actually set me up with this interview. This fella is a very interesting character. He grew up in Indiana, southern Indiana, and was working for the phone company as a lineman. He got the job. He was living on a farm and they were desperate. He heard that a guy working for the phone company got injured severely in an accident, and he raced over to there and said, "Can I take his place?" And that's how he got on with them. But he got laid off in the early 30s. His sister, though, was a school teacher. Remember I said, if you had a job, generally as a postman, a school teacher, or whatever, you were okay. His sister loaned him money to go to embalming school in Cincinnati, Ohio. A funeral director in upper state New York in Buffalo sent a letter down saying, "I want your next graduate." So he got on a train, went to Buffalo, arrived in the classic snowstorm in Buffalo, walked 2 miles over to find this guy's place, got there late at night. The guy handed him a lab coat and said, "Put this on. We got a showing at 8 in the morning." So see, this was a Catholic funeral home. At that time, funeral homes, they did either Catholics or Protestants, and occasionally they do a Jewish person. But they had the franchise, so to speak, for the Catholics. And he told me interesting stories about most of the showings actually were in people's homes. The funeral director and Jim would go there. They would embalm the thing. He said, when they weren't looking, we'd pour the blood down the toilet. But he said, he also told me a lot of details about how you do a nun when a nun dies. And
what's different?
Well, first of all, you can't take off their clothes. Their undergarments. So the nuns were never allowed to be naked. So you had to, he said they were buried in dirty underwear. He said, but also you had to have 2 nuns present while you were doing it to make sure you weren't touching the nun. So he said that job would always fall to the most youngest and junior nuns because no one wanted to do it. And he said these girls, young girls, would be sitting there horrified watching them embalm a person. But that was one of the
What
jobs.
actually, I don't know about embalming, or that is the process. Is it where you put some kind of non-blood fluid into the vascular system of a human being to preserve their bodies so it stops decaying? Is that how it works?
Exactly. I think it was formaldehyde that you would put in there. And
so basically you stuck an epidermic needle or some needle into the vascular system, and you drain the blood out and put in formaldehyde to keep the body from decaying from the veins out. Is that it?
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
He ended up working in Buffalo for a long time. Then he went down and was also worked for funeral homes down in the New York City area. That's where he actually got married down there. He had told a funny story. When he was in upper state New York there, he actually met his wife. One of his buddies had his girlfriend and his future wife with him at like a basketball game or something. And they knew he was working late. So he met his wife while he was working, embalming someone in the funeral home. Not a real romantic thing. But like I said, I got a lot of interesting stories.
That's a very touching story.
Yeah, this guy right here was from Wenatchee, Washington.
Born the same year as my father. That's the year my dad was born.
Really, 1919. Well, this guy was a character. He was born in California, I think in the San Francisco area, but his mother died at childbirth and his father didn't want him. So he was raised by his aunts. And he said, I was passed from aunt to aunt to aunt. I ended up with my grandfather. He and I didn't get along. This was, I think, in Spokane, Washington. He literally hopped a freight and went out to Wenatchee, got there and got a job sweeping floors in a whorehouse in one of the hotels. And the girls, he said, were nice to him. And I said, how nice were they, Arden? I said, no, none of that. He said, but they said, you shouldn't be working here. He said, I don't have any choice. I'll starve. And they said, put an ad in the paper and see if you can find parents. He did that. He put an ad in the paper and a couple answered it, and he got parents through an ad in the paper. They had the Hupmobile dealership in town. But during the Depression, they lost it. And so they were dairy farmers. And so he told me a lot about the different types of cattle, what type of cattle you get the cream from that gives you the best amount of fat in the milk. I was on a farm, but I raised rabbits. So I didn't know anything about dairy farming.
Tell the younger members of our audience what a Hupmobile is.
A Hupmobile was built in in the early 1900s. It was one of the first types of cars. I actually was selling books last summer up in Greenville, Maine, and a couple came along. It was during the fly-in, and I mentioned the Hupmobile, and the lady said, "We've got one." I said, "What?" And she showed me on her phone a picture, fully restored picture of them driving a 1912 Hupmobile, which started out as an economy car, but they then changed their marketing and started building really expensive cars. And that didn't work during the 30s. And that's why they went out of business. Also, you'll see coming up, I'm going to have you a photo of this Curtiss-Wright pusher airplane. I said to this lady in Maine, I said, there's also a picture in the book of a plane. She said, stop. I'll bet you it's a Curtiss-Wright pusher. And I said, it is. And she said, we've got one. I said, what? And she shows they have to be the only people in the world that have actual a plane and an old automobile that I mentioned in the book. But Arden was quite a character. And as you can see, he was a little younger than some of the people I interviewed. He would have only been in his late 70s when I interviewed him. Here's an aviator. This fella, his mother was a teacher, so they always had food on the table. But he wanted to be an aviator, so he was a freshman at the University of Washington, enjoying the Marine Corps Reserves, and ended up being able to be selected to go to flight school. So he traveled across the country with his mom in a car. You can imagine the roads at that time. And actually in Oklahoma, looked out the window and saw a gusher come in. They had never seen that before.
What year are we talking about? He goes across the country. What year?
This was in the late 30s. It was before the war.
Okay.
He actually ended up flunking out of aviation training down there. A long story I talk about in the book about how that happened due to a disgruntled instructor. He said that was failing everybody because he was an engineer and didn't want to have to do these check flights. He said it was the best and luckiest thing that ever happened to him because every one of his Marine Corps classmates in flight school was killed in flight accidents in the Aleutians during the war, flying into the side of mountains in that terrible weather that you have up in Alaska in those Aleutian Islands. Ken came back and ended up popping rivets for Boeing, and then ended up getting into learning to fly. And this was the plane I talked about. This is the Curtiss-Wright pusher. Notice where the propeller is. That's why it's called a pusher. It's in the back of the airplane. He gave me this photo. He said actually several people were killed walking into that propeller. But he ended up being a test pilot that I mentioned earlier down in Los Angeles during the war when they were building all the airplanes down there. They were flying, the planes that his Marines were flying were PBYs. This lady I mentioned because she had a story that I almost cried when she told me about it. Her father was this guy named Roebuck, who was a self-taught lawyer who was really involved in Republican politics. And he was the guy that always told her that he was almost personally responsible for Warren G. Harding becoming president. So her brother, political family, her father got her brother a job as postmaster there. The problem is her father died of a stroke in 1925. When the Democrats came in control in the 30s, in early 30s, those were all political patronage jobs. And he was the only one that had a job in her family. And so they didn't have any money. She and her mom moved. She had a small baby at the time. She was divorced, moved to Columbus, Ohio. And this is where the story she told me that almost caused me to cry. She left the baby with her mother. They had no money, no job. And she walked around the State House in Columbus on the outside she said, I was trying to, her words, screw up enough courage to be able to go in and beg for a job. And finally she went in and found someone that had known her father, and they gave her some small job. That lasted until that politician got thrown out. And then she was able to find a job working as a cleaning lady for one of the big hotel in town that I talk about in the book. But at that time, if you were a cleaning person, you always had to go in through the back door. Also, I talked to a lot of people about hobos and riding trains. And they said that the hobos all knew when you go into a town where to get off and where to go to the back door of a home where they would give you food. Her situation, though, Meg here, was really, I think, symptomatic of how desperate times could get when you're actually begging for things. This is the most beautiful lady. This is a picture she gave me. I didn't take this picture. This Eleanor lived in New England. Her father in New Bedford, Mass. And her father did have a job. He could do engine repairs for the fishing fleet. They are mostly Portuguese there in New Bedford. The thing I found interesting about her was she lived through the tremendous hurricane that wiped out New England in 1938. Everyone I talked to, Ron, always had a story about some terrible natural event, like the earthquake in LA, the 37 flood along the Ohio River, this particular, the Dust Bowls, this lady with that terrible hurricane. It literally wiped out all of southern New England. These four ladies were all in nursing training with my mother in the 30s. Every one of these ladies came from a different part of Kentucky. One from Western Kentucky. She actually grew up in a town called Tobacco. That's Ophelia, the lady on the right, the Ophelia right here. This next lady, her name was Bessie Bussey, and she was from Torrent, which was up in Appalachia. This lady, Mary Munster, she came from Squiresville, which was in the middle of the state of Kentucky. And this lady, believe it or not, her name was Ida Lee. Ida Lee grew up in California, Kentucky.
Where in the state of Kentucky is California, Kentucky?
It's on the Ohio River. Ironically, it was upriver from where I grew up in California, Kentucky. Very small. It got wiped out by the flood every year.
So it's Western Kentucky?
No, it's right along, it's in northern Kentucky, about close to Maysville, halfway between Cincinnati and Maysville, really, where Rosemary Clooney grew up. My mother's in the lower left here, Clarice Hogan down here in the lower left. A lot of stories about how most of the nurses were in 3-year programs, where the first year they were essentially bedpan carriers, all the dirty jobs. Second year, they really learned nursing. They all lived in a home right next to the hospital, and that was run like a Gestapo prison camp. And the ladies in here would be inspected every morning to make sure their shoes were white. They had their little kit with them. They had to carry a kit that had scissors and bandages And they actually carried hypodermic needles with them. And they would put them in boiling water to sterilize them before they injected you with things. When they were in their final year, their third year in nursing, they actually carried all the narcotics with them. They just had them in their pockets. This hospital was basically run by nursing students and a few doctors who were residents, and they had maybe 4 nurses for the whole hospital. That's the hospital I was actually born in.
Wow.
Just a few common themes I want to talk about. People were everyone I talked to, even the women, always told me about their first car. I mean, indelible memories of it. Also, every one of these people generally, except the rich lady, worked as children, but you always had to give the money to your parents. You would come home and you didn't keep the money. You gave it to your parents. They didn't even think about keeping it. A lot of these boys were caddies if they was near a golf course, or they worked on farms. My dad, for example, had to quit. He was born in 1898. He had to quit school in the 3rd grade and go to work on a horse-drawn milk wagon. And he had to give his money to his mom. But there was a lot of social interaction that we may not have now. People would have picnics all the time, neighborhood parties. I interviewed some Mennonites. They would do barn raisings. So people would find ways to entertain themselves. So my question is, for all of our listeners, are you ready? I mean, do you think you're going to have this determination, as you can see from the slide, these 3 qualities to be able to handle a situation if our economy goes in the tank? And it's not an impossibility. And but I found that what these people did to survive, I feel, provides lessons for us in case we have a similar situation.
Okay, so I've got a question for you. Thoughtful presentation, thoughtful question in the end. And people can buy this book, you're saying, on Amazon.
And on Amazon, if they want a signed copy, they can go to edlinz.com.
Wonderful. So Ed, we saw the recession in 2008.
Yes.
And we saw the banking system go upside down, and internationally that damaged America's credibility as an economic powerhouse and as a manager of economies. And many people compared it to the Great Recession in the 30s. And one wonders what government policies would have worked better in 2008 than what we used, and what were the forces that helped us recover from 2008, and what were the forces that diminished or slowed our recovery?
I think to answer your question, you to a certain extent, in 2008, we are comparing apples and oranges because of the presence of many of the programs which did not exist back in the 30s. And I'm talking basically about unemployment insurance that was available. So if indeed you did lose your job during the 2008 timeframe, you did have something to fall back on in terms of government assistance. Also, we had tools available from the Federal Reserve that were not being necessarily used during the 30s. I don't think, if I recall, from 2008 through 2010, we did not have anything like the unemployment levels that we had during the 30s.
Right.
Nothing similar. And when we learned, quite frankly, we also had much better means of communication. In other words, we had the ability to actually see ahead of time, to a certain extent, that these banks were in trouble. And we were able to bail out Lehman Brothers, I believe that was it, and various other things that were collapsing. So I think we had tools available to us at that time that we did not have back in the 30s. With respect to the present time, I'm going to withhold comment until I see what the Federal Reserve does. You know, they initially talked about 3 rate hikes. Now I'm hearing 7. Who knows what's going to take place? I do know that we are considerably further in debt nationally than we were at any of those other two things. If you look at our national debt now, compared even to 2008 through 2010, it's monstrously higher. And part of that is because because of COVID, basically did considerably more deficit spending. Will those chickens come home to roost? I don't know. I think the best word is to say stay tuned.
Hey, so Ed, it's been great, listening to your story. You have a fascinating life story, and you've told some fascinating life stories in this presentation. They never threw anything away. Seems like a completely fascinating topic and book. And it's fun to kind of remember the history, because my folks were part of that whole generation, as were yours. And I've been kind of reliving their story as people born at the same time as my mom and dad are the sort of subjects of your book. So great having you come as a guest to the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon. When you come back to California, you got to come out to the yacht club and have lunch with us at the club in person. That'd be nice. The club was built in 27 and 28. So it was built during the heyday of the 20s. And immediately after it was built, the big depression took place, and we watched the yacht club's fortunes kind of roll along through all of that. Really great having you as a guest, Ed.
It's my pleasure, Ron, and best wishes to you and every member of the club and everyone that gets a chance to see these wonderful Wednesday luncheon videos. Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon.